In this video, I'm going to explain why many advanced economies around the world are facing long-run fiscal stress. By long run, what I mean is that this is a problem that's going to be with us in coming decades, not merely over the next few years. And by stress, what I mean is that governments are going to be running substantial fiscal imbalances unless there are substantial changes to policy. So what's the source of the problem? The source of the problem is that governments have made promises. So they've promised old age benefits, but they haven't made any provisions for how to finance these. So without making financing provisions. So in the United States, the two main programs I'm talking about are Social Security and Medicare. Why are we running into these problems? Well, we're running into these problems because these programs are financed on what's called a pay-as-you-go basis. Affectionately referred to as pay-go. The way a pay-go system works is you tax workers and you give benefits to retirees. Now, if you want to keep tax rates low, you're going to need many workers per retiree. So a system like this works just fine if you happen to have a young population. And the United States and many of these other advanced economies did have young populations through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, largely because of the baby boom. We get to what I think is really the nub of the problem. Populations around the world are aging. And in particular, what I mean is that this big bulge in population associated with the baby boom is starting to retire. And this implies that we're going to have fewer workers per retiree, at least going into the future. So the bottom line is that pay-go systems are not viable when you've got these kinds of demographic shifts going on. If you try to maintain the historic tax rates. So, of course, one possibility is that we'll adjust tax rates, and another possibility is that we'll cut benefits, or some mix of the two. While the long-run fiscal stress problems facing advanced economies are widely acknowledged, I'm not sure that the scale of the problem is very well appreciated. So I'm going to go through some facts about how big the problem is that we're facing in coming decades. But first, I'm going to start by showing you what the genesis of the problem is, which is aging populations around the world. This bar chart shows you the dependency ratio, which is population 65 and older, so you should think of that as retirees, relative to ages 15 to 64, and you should think of that as the working age population. So as you remember, in these pay-go systems, they rely on having a lot more workers than retirees. So that's like saying that you need a low dependency ratio in order to make the pay-go systems work. And as you can see, what these three bars represent, the blue bar is 1960, the dependency ratio, the red bar is 2005, and the green bar is the projection for 2050. And if you look across these countries, and it's a pretty wide range of countries, there are some advanced economies in here, there are emerging economies in here, including the ones that are growing very rapidly these days, like China, Indonesia, and India. And what you see across these countries is that the blue bars tend to be rather small, meaning that in 1960, the dependency ratio was small enough, we had plenty of workers per retiree, that nobody was sweating whether these pay-go systems were going to be viable. By 2005, those dependency ratios had risen, and in some countries, like, for example, Germany or Japan, they had risen quite a bit, and so those populations had already aged quite a bit. But in general, even in 2005, particularly among these emerging economies, the issue of the demographics was not on anybody's plate. But now if you go forward and you project what the demographics will look like in these countries in a few decades, you can see that almost without exception, we get dependency ratios shooting way up. And in countries like Germany, Japan, Korea, and Spain, they're extremely high. What this is telling you is that in the absence of substantial reforms to these entitlement programs, or very rapid increases in tax rates on workers, these systems, these pay-go systems, are just not going to work. If we turn to the United States, you can see that the problems in the U.S. are quite a bit less severe than in those other countries that I pointed out. Our dependency ratio, even back in 1960, was a bit higher than in some of these other countries, but we're not getting as rapid a run-up in the dependency ratios as, say, in Korea and Japan. Part of the reason for this is differences in immigration policies, where it's easier to immigrate to the United States than, say, to Korea or Japan, and that allows the U.S. to sort of keep a relatively young workforce. Now, if we turn to the United States exclusively, what I'm going to show you are some long-term projections by the Congressional Budget Office for these entitlement programs. This shows you actual Social Security spending as a share of GDP going back to 1962. And then starting about 2010 or so, these are projections. And you can see that, yeah, Social Security is going to chew up a bigger percentage of the economy than it has in the past. But this is really pretty much small potatoes. There are some straightforward solutions, such as increasing retirement age, that would solve the Social Security problem. So what is the problem? The problem is Medicare and Medicaid. And as you can see, Medicare and Medicaid is projected by the end of this projection period to chew up about 1/4 of the U.S. economy. Now, this is partly a matter of aging populations, but it's also partly that medical costs have been rising more rapidly than inflation, and these projections build that continued increase in the relative cost of medical expenditures into the forecasts. Now, if we take these two and we add on to them you can see this vertical distance is constant, so this is just saying some constant amount of other federal spending, other than on interest payments. You can see that by the end of the projection period, the U.S. government will be taking up about 1/3 of the economy. Now, this picture is kind of interesting because this mountain peak here is the recession that we just went through, where we had a very big increase in things like unemployment compensation and so forth. Now, these projections, of course, are assuming we don't have anything like that. In fact, they don't even assume that there could be recessions in the future. It's just a nice smooth path. But even in that rather rosy scenario, you can see that the size of the government is projected to increase dramatically. What the Congressional Budget Office also does is it says, suppose we take tax law and spending law as given, and we just roll the deficits over into debt. Now, what would be the path of government debt? And when you do that, you get this mile-high picture. And as you can see, this little hiccup is World War II. Now you see why in a previous video I said, I'm not all that worried about what's happening right now to fiscal policy. What I'm really worried about is where it's going in coming decades. These pictures are implausible. They're saying that if you look at the alternative scenarios, that the government debt GDP ratio gets to be 700-800%. And government debt cannot grow at this pace for very long. So we know that these projections can't happen as a matter of economic logic. So the best way to interpret these is that this is really a cautionary tale that tells you that, gee, maybe we shouldn't be obsessing about the little burp that we're seeing right here. Maybe our concern should be more about the future. This problem, while we've seen it in the United States, is almost worldwide. And what I'm showing here are projections from the Bank for International Settlements for a variety of countries. These are all European countries. And you can see that under the baseline scenario, which assumes that policies don't change in the future, government debt explodes in all of these countries. The same is true if we include Japan and the US as the non-European countries. Japan's an interesting case because its gross debt as a share of GDP now is already about 200%, but it's projected to continue to grow at this, what we would call an exponential rate. The problem of long-run fiscal stress is not unique to the United States. It applies to all of these advanced economies. It's fiscal stress because the government has made a lot of spending commitments without providing for the revenues to finance those commitments. And all of these projections show you what happens in a world like that. Another way to calculate this is to ask, if you take the present value of all of those promised spending commitments and you subtract off the present value of the tax obligations that are assumed in the future, you get what is called the unfunded liabilities. And what you can do is take that difference, the present value of that difference, which is like the present value of future deficits, and ask what percentage of current GDP does that constitute. If we look at a country like Australia, this says that all of those commitments in the future that we have not made provisions to fund take up about 5 times Australian GDP today. Now that number is much bigger in some other countries like Canada, Korea, or Spain.